All right, where are we going?
At Brookhaven.
Williams was the name of the doctor said that
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe 4 days, weeks.
She asked me to print them off, but I will send them.
And then, he didn't say expect miracles, but.
Yeah.
But
Well, you
Which I'm
expected
not,
more than you
yeah.
got.
Yeah.
and Sonia, what's her last name?
Page.
Page. Oh,
Yeah, Page.
okay. But can you give me your address?
Oh,
The second cataract operation is what it was.
Yes.
Yeah. Your official walking and talking paper.
Yeah.
What they call snail mail.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay, good normal.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Now, Ray Barber here.
Appreciate that.
I think you probably noticed, if you looked at the table over there, that there's an evaluation sheet, and what we're going to try to do after the end of every teaching period is to pass out an evaluation, because we want to get better feedback from you folks about what kinds of classes you like and what you'd like to see offered, and we're also open for any suggestions for improvement as well. And I really appreciate it. Now, you don't have to put your name on there, those are completely anonymous. But I really appreciate if you fill that out, and they're doing the same thing in the other class as well. I have pencils. Anybody need a pencil or a pen to do the evaluation? Y'all set? Pencils and pens? Okay. All right, we'll give it maybe a couple more minutes, and we'll see who straggles in and who doesn't, and we'll get started. We're going to wrap it up today.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else need form? Evaluation form?
Thanks.
Need an evaluation form? Evaluation form?
I got it, yeah, thanks.
Oh, you, with your husband. We know what that
Better be pretty hard on.
There is room for
You want to evaluate form?
We need to destroy the evaluate your husband forms. This should not exist.
All right, so we'll maybe give it one more minute to get started. Does anybody have any questions? No? I do. Yeah, Tom.
What was, why did they hire out? You may have covered this early on. Was it just they built the chapel and then they said, wow, this is really blank, let's do something about it? Like, can you
Yeah.
cover how, like, it even started from the building to the ceiling to Michelangelo painting?
Actually, that was the first lecture.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that.
I can give you the 20-second sort of
Yes,
summary of that. The chapel was built around 1480. It was built by the Pope, who was named Pope Sixtus IV, and that's why it's called the Sistine Chapel. It's named after this Pope Sixtus, right? And as soon as he built it, he hired, it was around, again, in the 1480s, he hired 5 or 6 famous painters from Florence to come down, and they painted the walls. The walls were the first things that were painted. And they painted the walls on both, going all the way around the chapel. And on one side is the life of Christ, and on the other side is the life of Moses. And they sort of played off one another. And the idea was to show the bringer of the old covenant, that is under the law, and then the bringer of the new covenant, that is Christ on the other side. Okay? And then, so that's the first campaign done around the 1480s. Beginning around 1508, the nephew of that pope also became pope. His name was Julius II. And he brought in Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. Michelangelo paints the ceiling. and he paints the ceiling from around 1508 down to 1512. And that's the way it stood until about 1535, when we get another pope, and his name is Pope Paul III, and he brought Michelangelo back in again to paint the resurrection of the body that's behind the front altar right there. So it actually 3 different painting campaigns. But it really, the iconography, the message of the iconography holds together really well, because what you see is painted on the top, right at the top. You work your way from the top down to the bottom, down to the wall of the resurrection of the body. You see God creating everything in perfection, right? Because God's perfect, God creates everything. He creates the world, He creates the universe, man and woman in perfection. And those are the first 5 or 6 panels of the ceiling. And then Adam and Eve sin, and everything's downhill from there. And so you get the last couple of frescoes on the ceiling showing the wages of sin. And you get the flood, God wipes out all of mankind. And this calls for something redemption. Is God just simply going to destroy all of mankind? And the answer is no. First of all, God gives the Hebrews the law, and He will allow the Hebrews to be redeemed if they live under the law. But then we get the new covenant, and that is the church, or Christ. And the idea here is that the church, the Catholic Church, is what's what I want to use? It is the instrument or the mechanism through which one gains salvation if you have the sacraments and if you believe in Christ. And then finally, what happens is you get that resurrection of the body on the front wall, and this shows you what happens if you do follow the church and you are saved, or if you don't follow the church and you're not saved. So the iconography, despite the fact that it's probably painted over about a 45, 50-year period, it really tells a whole story. And the reason we think this happens is because there were theologians working with these guys all the way along. This is what we need right here. This is how we're going to hold the whole thing together.
What's how they were painted, like compared to other buildings of the time period? Did they all have like storytelling, or is that unique to the Sistine Chapel or that area? For the
this is not at all atypical. These are frescoes, right? They're painted right on wet plaster, and that's why they're still there, because they're literally the wall. This was a technique that had been pioneered in Florence, and that's why they brought these Florentine painters to Rome, because they knew what they were doing and they'd done this before. So you can find these sorts of fresco cycles in a lot of different places. A lot of different churches have them. Yeah, this is not unique at all. Okay, good set of questions. All right, well, welcome back. We're going to wrap it up to date. Take a look at the final couple of frescoes here that Michelangelo painted, and I will give you some sense of, I should use this. I'll give you some sense of what Luther's reaction would be to that. All right, so once again, just to refresh your mind, we worked our way starting down here all the way through creation. We see the creation of Adam and Eve here in the center. Then we see the temptation of Adam and Eve, and they fall from grace. And after that, everything goes downhill. We talked about the sacrifice of Noah last week, and we're going to finish up looking here at the flood and then at the drunkenness of Noah, the final 2 panels on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Okay. All right, going back to the flood in Noah's Ark, I just want to pick up, this is where we left off, and this again is the biblical passage that Michelangelo is working from when he conceptualizes the flood itself. The waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily upon the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, and all swarming creatures that swarm upon the earth, and every man. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And this then, working from this passage, this is how Michelangelo has interpreted this. And I want to spend just a little bit of time. I showed you this fresco last week, but I want to show you just a couple of close-ups here of how Michelangelo has depicted the destruction of mankind. And it's really heart-rending when you look at this, because He's depicted, for instance, you see this mother and a child here, and you see this woman over here on the left and this baby up there on her head. They're fleeing the floodwaters right here, but we know that they're all going to perish. And then you see this man bringing what I take to be his wife on his back, trying to reach the higher ground. Trying to reach the higher ground right here, and they too are going to be wiped out. And then right here in the center, you see this man trying to climb up this tree to get even higher. This mother and children, all of them are going to be wiped out by the flood. And then he is also, that's this scene over here on the left-hand side. And you see, again, all the people coming up, trying to get to higher ground, and many of them are starting to be overcome by the water. There's a boat in the middle of this scene right here. And if you look at it closely, what you can see, there are about 7 or 8 people in the boat, and there are other people trying to get in the boat, and some of them are, they have pitchforks, and they're trying to keep the people out of the boat. So you can see the angst and just the frightfulness of all of this in the actions of the people in the boat. And then this scene over here, this looks to be some sort of a cave on a rocky outcropping, and we have a close-up of that as well. You can see this man bringing one of his sons, or perhaps one of his neighbors, out of the water, reaching this high ground here, and all of these people huddling underneath that rock and trying to get back into that cave. But we know this man over here is hanging on to the root of a tree. But once again, we know all of these people are going to die because of their sins and because of the flood. Okay, so what would Luther's reaction to this be? And it's pretty graphic. I mean, Michelangelo is depicting the total elimination of mankind here, from the very old to the youngest child, because of the wrath of God. So what is Luther's response to this going to be? I think it's not that Luther's cold or Luther's hard-hearted, but Luther, he spent a lot of time talking in his commentary, talking about the kinds of evil that these people had done to bring this onto themselves. And he finally concludes right here, just as the ancient world was the most corrupt, so it was also subjected to horrible punishment. When he says the ancient world, he's talking about the world prior to the flood. That's what he's talking about. Not only did the adults perish who had provoked God by their evil deeds, but even that innocent age, that is these babies and young children, which has no knowledge whatever and cannot tell right from wrong. So I think that Luther, as grim as it is, and as horrific as that depiction of the destruction of mankind is, I think that Luther would have approved of that simply because it's textual, biblical, I should say, and this was what God in his anger decided to visit upon mankind. All right, do you have any questions over that? All right. Okay. All right, let's go. The other thing I want to talk about before I leave this panel right here, and this is really fascinating, and that is, let me get to it, Noah's Ark. See that ark back there? That the people are, they're seeking refuge in the ark. That's not Noah and his family. Noah and his family are already inside of the ark. What we have there are people who are trying to somehow get out of the water and save themselves, and they see this ark floating by, and so they are doing everything they can to try to get into the ark itself. All right, so here's the biblical text for Noah's Ark. This is what Michelangelo is working from as he decides to paint Noah's Ark in this flood panel. Okay, Genesis 6, verses 13 through 16. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with bitumen. That's pitch, right? Tar. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a window for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. All right, so this is the text that Michelangelo is going to work from, but you have to remember that artists had been depicting the flood in Noah's Ark for centuries and centuries and centuries. And interestingly enough, for the longest time, probably beginning around 300, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, artists began to conceptualize Noah's Ark as a boat with a church inside it. Right? And here's a fresco, a 12th century mosaic from a church in Sicily with a depiction of Noah's Ark with a church inside of it. And the way that they, the reason that they did this was because they took the ark as being an allegory for salvation. And just as Noah and his family found salvation inside of the ark, so too men would find salvation inside of the church. And so they began to portray Noah's Ark as a boat. You can see this boat right here, but the structure on the inside of it takes on the architecture of a church. And this is a medieval church. You can see those rounded Roman arches right there, and this pediment on the end of it. It's very much church-like. And going up into, just prior to, or during Luther's lifetime, I'm showing you this one right here. This is from Nuremberg. It was from a history of the city of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Chronicles, and Nuremberg is probably about 200 miles from where Luther was in Wittenberg. And I show you this because this was a common perception of the ark during Luther's time. And once again, what you see is it is depicted as a boat. You can see this boat. This is not quite church-like. This is more like a German house, right? You've got that gabled roof right there, just a big German house. But you can see that this is a depiction of the ark. Just prior to, one of the depictions, just prior to the time that Michelangelo is painting the ark, conceptualizing the ark in his depiction of the flood in the Sistine Chapel. However, by the time of Luther and Michelangelo, and that is moving into 1500, 1510, biblical scholars tended to turn away from these types of portrayal in favor of a more literal and historical interpretation of the text. In other words, there's nothing in the text that says the ark looks like a church. It doesn't look like a church at all, right, according to Scripture. And we can see this more historical and literal interpretation at work in Michelangelo's depiction of Noah's Ark. And let's take a look then at what Michelangelo has done. This is Noah's Ark, okay, from Michelangelo. The Latin word arca, A-R-C-A, which was used to translate the original Hebrew word, means chest or box, right? A small, not small, but a chest or a box, something which you can put something in that's going to be safe, something for safekeeping inside of this chest or box. Michelangelo has, in fact, given us a very boxy ark on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, completely turning away from the usual floating boat with a church on the inside. He has placed the ark in the midst of rising water as people are still attempting to flee the flood. And you can see them gathered around the ark here. There's a ladder. They're trying to climb up and get into the ark. Some people are being pulled from the water down below. There's a fellow with an axe over here trying to open up the door, absolutely to no avail. And so the flood waters are going to eliminate these people as well. But from our perspective, what we're interested in is the way that Michelangelo is following the text, right? That Latin word arca means box, and so he's giving us a very, very boxy ark. This is more of a literal interpretation of the text itself. Over here on the right-hand side, we can see Moses, not Moses, but Noah. He's reaching out and he's gesticulating up either towards God or the heavens. And then you see up there at the very top in that window, there is a dove, and eventually that dove is going to be sent out by Noah. And when it doesn't come, or when it comes back, it's going to bring an olive leaf with it, and Noah will realize that the lands are starting to appear once again. So this is what Michelangelo has done with this text. Okay, any questions on this? I just have to say it's going to take a miracle to keep that thing afloat. It doesn't look very suitable, does it? It looks like it's going to tip right up. Yeah, a lot of pitch. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Did Michelangelo label what he painted?
No, except when it comes to the Symbols and the prophets. He specifically names the Symbols and the prophets. Yeah. Well, we know pretty well what's going on right here. I mean, you look at that and you can tell it's the flood. Yeah. And again, Michelangelo's not the first one to paint this stuff. This stuff has been painted again and again and again. So it's not hard to figure out actually what he's doing. Any other questions about this? So the question is, what would Luther think about this? If Luther went in there and he stared up and he saw this boxy thing staring down, pretending to be the ark, I think in general, he would have appreciated what Michelangelo has done here. He acknowledged that there's a great deal of uncertainty over what the ark actually looked like. This is from his commentary on Genesis on this passage. But in attempting to come to some conclusion, we can see him trying to be as historical as possible. That is, giving a literal interpretation to the text. Oops, wait. Let me read to you what he says right here. I thought I had it up there, but I don't. He says, this is from Luther. He says, some maintain that it was square, others that it was pointed, something like our houses in Europe. I myself believe that it was square, for Eastern people were not familiar with gabled houses. And remember that picture I showed you from Nuremberg Chronicle, right? It's a gabled house. He says that's what we live in around here, but they didn't have that stuff in the East, and he said they wouldn't have known that. He said, I myself believe that it was square, for Eastern people were not familiar with gabled houses. Those they live in were square. It is clear from the gospel that they walked about on the roof. The shape of the temple was similar. Okay, so I think he would have kind of liked this, but I want to show you what he really liked, because we have an illustration from one of Luther's own works, which he published in the year 1524. He did a translation, a German translation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Bible, and it was published in 1524. And his good friend and drinking buddy, Lucas Cranach, who's a famous painter, actually did some illustrations for this text. And this is how the ark was portrayed in Luther's Bible, right? You see it right here, this long flat thing right here, all the way across. And it's really interesting because this is sort of a composite etching right here. We can see the flood. The waters are coming down from the heavens and rising up from the ground. There are bodies here in the foreground that are dead, and trees and things floating around. And the ark is just simply weathering the deluge. But then over here on the left-hand side, we actually have that dove that is bringing back the olive branch. So this shows you a clearing. Then the waters are going to stop, and the floods are going to recede right here. But this is Luther approved of this, right? This is how he's sort of conceptualizing the ark itself. All right. So, and I don't think, although there's obviously a lot of difference between this and this right here, both of them are trying to be historical about this, right? They're not depicting some sort of fanciful church in the middle of this boat. Yes, please.
Are either of those close to, like, there's actual dimensions given in Genesis?
Yeah.
Like to scale. Which one is closer?
I can't tell you. If you have to ask the artist about that. There are some, for instance, I've seen some depictions of the ark that actually have the cubits marked off on them. These don't do that. And I don't know if they were trying to actually do these to scale or not. I can't answer that question for you. Yes, please.
Does this picture imply that the first story is underwater?
It looks like it, doesn't it? It looks like there's really heavy draft, and that the whole first story is underwater. Because Luther himself, let me read to you, Luther in his commentary says he divides the ark into 3 stories. He says, on the upper level, Noah lived with his family and the birds. On the middle level, the clean animals. And on the lower level were kept the unclean animals. So he knew that there was going to be 3 levels, right? So obviously what you have to suppose is that there's a whole other level underwater right there.
A lot of pitch.
Yeah, a lot of pitch to keep the thing afloat. Yeah, no doubt about it. So I think if you go back to what Michelangelo's done right here, we have 3 levels. Here's the bottom level. You see that bottom level? It is unadorned and unarticulated at all. That's where the unclean beast would be. And then we have the clean beast on the second level, and then on that gabled roof, and it goes up to a clear story which is flat on the top. That's where he would have said that Noah and his family are going to live with the birds, that sort of aviary area up there at the top. So I think he would have cut Michelangelo some slack and said, well, we don't know, it could have looked like that. And I think he would have probably given him a nod for what he's trying to do. All right, Luther, and this is interesting, in the midst of the flood and all of these people being slaughtered or being drowned, Luther finds God's mercy and grace even in the midst of this destruction. Listen to what he writes right here. He says, God talking to Noah.
For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which there is the breath of life from under the heavens. Everything that is on earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons and wives, and you. And Luther spends a lot of time talking about this, how God, even though he is a righteous God, and he's visiting justice upon all of those sinners out there, in his mercy and grace, he saves a remnant of people. And Luther emphasizes this because Luther understands God to be merciful. He's not just a righteous and angry God, but he's also a merciful God at the same time. Okay, any questions about or observations about the flood itself and the way that Michelangelo has treated them, or what Luther's reaction would be to them? Yes, please, Eric.
Not so much on the Sistine Chapel, but I guess historically, it says that 8 souls altogether. That's what was in the ark, was 8 people.
Yeah, you've got Noah, and you've got his wife, and you've got his 3 sons, and then their 3 wives as well. So we've got 4 men and 4 women to repopulate the earth after the flood. They better get busy. They got a lot of work to do. This is going to be huge, actually. I mean, this is going to, Genesis spends a lot of time talking about the repopulation of the earth after the flood. Okay, so we're going to go to that. All right, biblical text for the 9th fresco depicting the drunkenness of Noah. And this is what Michelangelo is working from right here. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This is obviously after they come off the ark. All right, and so Noah tries to do this, right? And Noah's working really hard, and then Noah just simply, as you know, he gets drunk, and you can't blame the guy. So let's listen to the text. Noah was the first tiller of the soil. Noah's the first farmer, the first tiller of the soil. He planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers. This is a biblical text that Michelangelo is going to work from as he shows us then the drunkenness of Noah. That's it right there, the drunkenness of Noah. So let's just take this apart so you can see what's going on. All right, over here on the left-hand side, you can see Noah. He's come off the ark, and he's going to start tilling the ground, and you can see him. He's busting up the ground, and eventually he's going to plant his grapevines right there. So this is very biblical over here on the left-hand side. Now, if you move to the center action right here, one of the interesting things about this is that rather than depicting Noah and his tent, which is what the Bible says, Michelangelo has decided to create a shed rather than a tent. And you see the heavy roof over the top of the shed, and you can see a little bit of the back wall. And then underneath that shed, there's this huge vat, obviously, where the wine has been fermenting. And then over here, there's a picture that Noah has used to, and you can see the spigot right there on the lower left-hand side of that vat. Noah's filled up his pitcher, and then he's poured it in his crater, and he's been sipping until he can sip no more. Somewhere along the line, he has gotten so drunk that all of his clothes have come off. Don't ask me how that happens, it just happens, okay? And there he is in a stupor. He can't even hold his head up. He's just so drunk that he can't even hold his head up. And you can see that this is Ham over here, this son with a blonde hair. He's the one that has discovered his father, and rather than covering his father up, he's gone out and he's in a very mocking way and showing great disrespect towards his father. He tells his brothers, and we have Shem and we have Japheth right here, tells his brothers, you ought to see Dad, he's so drunk he's naked in there, right? He's just fallen down drunk. Well, the 2 brothers, the 2 other brothers who are showing a lot of respect and a lot of reverence for their father, rather than looking upon his nakedness, take a blanket, and what they're doing is, you can see them, they have their eyes averted, and they are backing up, and they are going to cover Noah with a blanket. Okay, so this is what Michelangelo depicted right here. Any questions over this? What's going on? All right, so let's, yes, please.
Any thought as to why the brothers are all naked?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really, really problematic depiction, isn't it? We're going to get to that. We are going to get to that. Okay. All right. Yeah. Interestingly, before I go on, one of the good sons is probably Japheth, this son over here, while Ham is, he's got his hand on and saying, look, there he is, I told you, he's just so drunk he can't even stand up. But the other son, with his eyes averted, it looks as though he's criticizing his brother and saying, you ought to be showing some respect to our father down there. So already perhaps some of the criticism, blowback has begun aimed at Ham for his disrespect. All right. Let's talk about the importance of what's going on right here, because, if you think of all the biblical scenes that Michelangelo could have painted on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, why did his theological advisor say, I want a picture of Noah's drunkenness? That's not the number one scene from the Old Testament that probably comes into your mind. What is the significance of this? The events in this scene are important because they set the stage for the repopulation of the earth after the flood by the descendants of Noah. This is laid out in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 10. Additionally, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Additionally, the curse of Canaan. This is Ham's son. Noah does not curse Ham. He curses his son Canaan. This is interesting. He curses his son Canaan. This curse helps to explain the way in which the history of the Hebrews unfolded as they came out of Egypt and then settled into the Promised Land. They had to wrestle the Promised Land away from the Canaanites, and there was enmity, there was anger and violence between the Canaanites and between the Hebrews. Now, if they all came from the same parents, this doesn't make sense, does it? Except we know that this happened right here, and Noah cursed Ham. Noah cursed Ham. So this is trying to make sense out of that history of the Hebrews. They invade the Promised Land and they conquer the Canaanites, and there's all this animosity between the Hebrews and the Canaanites. All right, here's what happened. Pushing ahead to chapter 10, right? We're going to leave this behind. Pushing ahead to chapter 10, this is where we get a description of the repopulation of the earth by Noah's children. This is what happened. Japheth and his sons moved into Asia Minor, Greece, and across Europe. They are, according to Scripture, and according to Luther, because Luther picks up on this, he argues that they are the Gentiles. So you can see Japheth moves then up into Europe, that area up and through there, and they become then, according to biblical commentators, the people who repopulated northern Europe. Ham, this is the son who has been cursed, is going to travel to Mesopotamia and establish a kingdom there, and he will begin, according to Luther and the Scriptures, begin to build the Tower of Babel. His offspring will move into Egypt, Africa, and Canaan. Egypt, Africa, and Palestine, that is Canaan. They are the ancestors of the Semites and the Canaanites. And then finally, Shem and his sons will initially live with his brother Ham in Mesopotamia. Eventually, some of his sons will move into Persia and India. You can see this map, right? Moving way out into Persia and India. And go online and just Google Shem as the ancestors of the Chinese and see what you come up with. There's some wild stuff out there, right? Fundamentalists have taken this stuff and argued that Shem is actually the ancestors of the Chinese. But anyway, okay. And their other sons will move into the Arabian Peninsula. Other sons of Shem will move into the Arabian Peninsula. They will also move into Palestine along with Ham. And from Shem's son Eber comes, according to commentators, biblical commentators, and Luther follows this, he argues that from Shem's son Eber comes the Hebrews. And out of this line then will come Jesus through Abraham. So we find then, and Luther hits this time and time again, that what you're seeing here is the repopulation of the earth, and right here in the division of the earth itself into these three different tribes of brothers, we can get a glimpse of Christ himself. Abraham is a descendant of Eber, who is a descendant of Shem, who is a descendant of Noah, and from Abraham then comes the line of Jesus himself. By the time of Michelangelo and Luther, here is how the text had come to be understood. So let me give you a text, a map from the time of Luther. You can see over here, this is Ham. It comes to be understood that Ham's descendants inhabited Africa and repopulated Africa. You can see Shem coming across the Arabian Peninsula here and up into Palestine, and then Japheth's clan is established up there in the north. Luther, this map would have made great sense to Luther. This is how he understood the world to have been populated after Noah's ark had come to rest. Okay, any questions over this? All right. There's a literal, in addition to this literal interpretation that we have been giving to this text, there's also, let me get back, a little, in addition to the literal interpretation that biblical commentators and theologians gave to this text, there was also an allegorical interpretation. In other words, you can see what's there, but it really means something else. There's more meaning to it than just specifically the literal interpretation. There was an allegorical theological interpretation of this episode in the Old Testament, and it was laid out by the Christian father St. Augustine all the way back in the late 4th and early 5th century. Okay, and according to St. Augustine, what's going on right here is that the planting of the vineyard by Noah was symbolic of the incarnation, Christ taking on flesh. This interpretation focused upon the wine, because there's plenty of wine being drunk here, as symbolic of the Eucharist, and that is particularly symbolic of the blood of Christ, the redemptive blood of Christ. St. Augustine argued that the humiliation of Noah caused by the wine alluded to the Word that humiliates itself by agreeing to become incarnated in the flesh. He said that the mocking of Noah by his son Ham was a prefiguration of the mocking of Christ at the time of his arrest and torture under the Roman governor Pilate. And the entire episode then, according to this allegorical interpretation, prefigured the salvation brought by Christ, which was reenacted every time a Mass was said in the Catholic Church. Okay? So that's the allegorical interpretation. So there's a literal interpretation that literally these two of the sons are blessed and one of the sons is cursed. This makes sense out of the repopulation of the earth, but then there is an allegorical theological interpretation as well, which sees Christ and the redemptive act of Christ in this fresco as well. All right, so the question is, what sense does Luther make out of all this? What would Luther say to all of this? I think Luther would have mixed feelings about the way in which Michelangelo has depicted this episode in the Bible. He would have found some things to like, yet some things would have bothered him greatly about it. So let's talk about what Luther would like here to begin with. Luther, in his commentary on Genesis, treated Noah's drunkenness in its meaning at length. He draws three great lessons from this story. His first lesson is this, that even the holiest of men can sin and sin greatly. Yet God forgives them. And this is typical Luther. Sin boldly, he says, right? And he says, we are at the same time sinners and justified. And what he's seeing here is that action, that even the holiest men, Noah, because Noah was so holy that God decided to save him and his family from destruction. And yet, coming out of the ark, he sins gravely. But God blesses Noah and he blesses his family and he forgives them. All right. So, Luther's commentary. Let's see what Luther has to say about this in his commentary. Oh, I want to show you this as well. This is picking up on that allegory that St. Augustine laid out, that this is actually an allegory of the planting of the vine is the Christ taking on the flesh, and then the wine itself is the blood of Christ. Here is a mosaic, and this is from the Church of San Marco in Venice. So the next time you're in Venice, you should look for this. But here is a mosaic which shows that quite clearly. You can see Noah over there, the grapes, symbolic of the Eucharist and symbolic of the wine. And you can see that communion cup that he's drinking out of right there. So here's how that allegorical interpretation is being depicted here by artists at the same time. All right, let's move on here. This is what Luther has to say about this, right? And that is that God forgives sins. The purpose of the Holy Spirit, however, is apparent from what we have said. It is to console by this record of the great sins committed by the holiest and most perfect patriarchs, those righteous persons who are discouraged by the knowledge of their own weakness and are therefore cast down. In them, that is, in these patriarchs who sinned, we are to find proofs of our own shortcomings, that we may come to humble confession and at the same time seek and hope for forgiveness. This is the real and theologically true reason why the Holy Spirit records, rather than seemingly more important matters about Noah, the great fall of this grand man. Okay? So this is typical Luther right here, right? Focusing upon God's grace and God's mercy in the face of sin itself. So this is the first lesson that Luther draws from this episode right here. It is meant to console us that even though we sin, we are going to be saved. If Noah can sin and he was a great and holy man and God forgives him, then certainly God will forgive us. The second lesson that Noah takes from this is that it drives home the point that children are to show respect towards their parents. And boy, does Luther ever spend pages and pages and pages talking about this. This is for him the great sin of Ham, and that is that he disrespected his father. All right? And he also goes on to say that not only are children supposed to show respect towards their parents, but that we are, in general, to take away from this, the idea that we are to show respect towards church officials, ecclesiastical officials, and towards state officials as well, that these have all been established by God. Now, he qualifies this because, as you know, Luther was enormously disrespectful towards ecclesiastical officials. Pardon my phraseology, but he calls the Pope a Babylonian whore, right? When he dedicates a book to Pope Leo, he literally calls him a Babylonian whore. This is not showing respect towards the Pope. What Luther has in mind here is that we are to show respect towards ecclesiastical officials and clergy who are preaching the gospel and doing God's work. This is what he means by this. So for him, the second great lesson coming out of this is you need to show respect. First and foremost to your parents, and his justification for this, of course, is the Old Testament commandment, right? To show honor towards your parents. And he says that this is, God has commanded this, and Ham has transgressed that commandment, and therefore Noah curses him. All right. I think he would like the way that Michelangelo is showing the way that Ham is disrespecting his father, and he's gesticulating out there. Look at the old drunken sot down there. He can't even get up off the floor. And I think that Luther would have approved of what's going on there. The third great point that Luther takes away from this, he agreed with a general interpretation of this episode that it laid the groundwork for explaining the hostility between the Canaanites and the Hebrews as they fought over the Promised Land. In fact, his commentary on the diaspora of Noah's sons, given in chapter 10 of Genesis, follows this customary interpretation of arguing that Shem, Japheth, and Ham and their descendants were responsible for repopulating the earth after the flood. And again, I could show you that map and I could reiterate it, but he just follows what we've already talked about. Japheth goes into Europe, Ham takes over Africa and the Middle East, and then Shem sort of follows Ham around, but eventually he's going to conquer the Promised Land. This latter point is particularly important for Luther because he declares that it is from the descendants of Shem, from his great-great-grandson Eber, that Jesus will be born. So he finds in this, then, a foretelling of what he calls the seed to come, right? The foretelling of the birth of Christ. All right. Any questions over that? Yes, please.
Trying to get the term Semites.
Yeah, Luther calls them, those are the Semites, just as he says that Japheth is the founder of the Gentiles. Yeah, that's a term that he uses. Any other questions? Yes, please.
In Genesis, it talks about, or I picked up that Noah cursed
Ham.
Canaan.
Yeah, Canaan. Yeah, Ham's son.
Okay.
Yeah. Why
His son and not him? Or by cursing his son, he cursed him and his whole line?
Yeah, that's what.
Did Ham have other sons?
Oh yeah, he had a lot of sons.
Or was just Canaan's line cursed? That's what I don't understand. Like.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the text. He has a number of sons, but it's the son who settles in Canaan, who settles in Palestine, that he specifically curses. And that the reason for this is the Bible is trying, this passage in Genesis is trying to make sense out of why there's such tremendous animosity between people who should be relatives, right? They're related. They should all be related, and you're not supposed to fight with your relatives here. You're not supposed to fight among the clan and among the tribe, but these brothers are, and they need to make sense out of that. So it comes from this cursing, and it's interesting. I mean, Luther spends a lot of time about this. He says, look, it is not Ham that's being cursed, but he's saying that God chooses to curse Canaan rather than Ham himself. Yeah. I can't recall the justification that Luther gives for that, but that's what the Bible says.
Okay, I was just wondering if they were the same person or if they were two different people.
They're two different people. Yeah, it's the son. It's the son rather than Ham himself.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and it wouldn't be, I mean, you know, one of the interesting things here, if you curse Ham, well, are people going to understand that he's the father of Canaan? It's, you know, if you say Canaan is cursed, we understand why there's enmity between us. It just makes it clear why there's, you know, fighting and bad blood between these two different groups who are related. All right. What Luther would not have liked about Michelangelo's portrayal of this event, and you've already gestured to this, Luther would have been greatly perturbed, I believe, that Michelangelo has chosen to portray the sons of Noah nude. This would have made no sense to him. In fact, it would appear to undermine the entire basis for the flow of events that came out of this episode. The cursing of Ham, or more properly, Ham's son Canaan, was a result of Ham having seen his father drunken and naked. Noah's nakedness brought shame upon him. His genitals were exposed, and the shame surrounding the naked human body was the result of the sin of Adam and Eve. This is why it's so shameful, right? Because now there's a sense of shame that the body itself is something that's shameful. Nakedness is something that is shameful as well. To Luther's mind, then, it would make little sense to show the three sons of Noah naked and then have one of them, Ham, point to the shame of Noah's nakedness. This just would not have resonated with Luther at all. Okay, so he would have had a lot of trouble with all the naked bodies up there on this fresco. And your question, I know that you're wondering is, well, then why did, because Michelangelo's theological advisor probably understood this just as well as Luther, why would he have allowed Luther to do this? Well, Luther is, not Luther, but Michelangelo. Why would he allow Michelangelo to do this? Michelangelo is given some leeway in what he's going to paint up there. And one of the things I think that Michelangelo is delighting in doing is he's painting, he wants to show the human body. Right? This is one of his fortes in showing the human body. And I think he was given license to do it right here. You need to know that there's blowback on this. Not everybody was happy with all of these nudes that were sort of frolicking around up there on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There were, as a matter of fact, theologians at the papal court who really criticized Michelangelo for doing this. There was one of them, and I forget his name right now, who was the, well, it's called the Master of Ceremonies, or what's the word I'm looking for? He is in charge of the papal household. He keeps the Pope's household running. And he was bitterly complaining to Julius II about all of these nudes. And as a matter of fact, Michelangelo eventually painted him down in one of the circles of hell when he gets around to painting the resurrection of the body. Yeah. And Michelangelo, while he was alive, Michelangelo never had to go back and retouch any of his paintings. Eventually, some of the bodies are, particularly the female bodies, but male bodies as well, genitalia are covered up and breasts and these sorts of things. But during the restoration, over the years, a lot of that stuff has been taken down. But anyway, so Luther would have had trouble with this. Not so much that Luther's a prude, but I think it just would not make sense to him to show those bodies naked like that. All right, regarding the allegorical interpretation of this text, first set forth by St. Augustine, and we've already talked about this, that this is actually an allegory of salvation through the blood of Christ. Luther says nothing about that, and that's because Luther does not like allegory. He leaves allegorizing to other people. Luther tries as best he can to give what he understands to be a literal and historical interpretation of the text. And when Genesis tells him that the repopulation of the earth begins right here with the cursing of Ham and then his two brothers, Luther takes that as literally what happened. But he will not go into allegory and say that there's a deeper allegorical meaning here. He just simply doesn't do that. All right. This brings us then to, if I can find it, let's sum up. Where are we here? We didn't see that. Okay, So, hang on just a second. Conclusion. And I typed this up for you so that you can follow along here in the conclusion. What conclusions can we draw from our study of Luther's critique of the Sistine Chapel? What would Luther like and what would he not like? I think what Luther would have liked about Michelangelo's ceiling, first of all, God is shown creating the universe and the world. And he would have liked this. Now, this seems pretty simple, but you have to understand there was a huge controversy at the time whether the world had always existed, whether matter had always existed, or whether, as according to Genesis, that God created the universe and the world out of nothing. And that first wonderful fresco that Michelangelo depicts up there, God separating light from the darkness, this shows that God, in fact, had created the universe, that the universe did not always exist. So he would like that an awful lot. He also likes the way that Michelangelo is depicting God bringing order out of chaos. This is something that Luther liked an awful lot as well. He would have approved of the dignity and beauty that Michelangelo gave to Adam and Eve before the fall, those gorgeous physical bodies and the beauty of the human body that he gave both to Adam as well as to Eve. Luther would have approved of those because he believed before the fall of Adam and Eve that the world and mankind and womankind was perfect, and he would have approved of the way in which Michelangelo depicted those bodies. I also think that he would have approved of the way in which Michelangelo depicted Adam and Eve during the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Remember, we talked about that. You can see those bodies are already showing the ravages of age and sin. They're haggard. There's anxiety on their faces. They're already starting to look old, and Luther would have appreciated that an awful lot. I also think that, as grim as it is, that he would have approved of those scenes, several scenes in which Michelangelo depicted the elimination of mankind from the world. And then also, very much the ark, the salvation offered to Noah and his family during the flood. He sees God's grace at work even during God's punishment. And finally, he would have approved of Noah in a drunken stupor, the way that Michelangelo has depicted Noah, because for him, the lesson here was that even the holiest of men sin and can gain salvation. So he would have approved of a number of treatments that Michelangelo has given to these episodes from the Old Testament on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. On the other hand, there are a number of things that he would have quarreled with. Michelangelo's God is shown physically creating, and Luther, this would have bothered him a lot. God seems to be this hands-on type of creator, picking up mud and making things and ordering things around. Luther argued that this was not how creation took place at all. He argued that God created through the spoken word, right? God spoke, God said, and it was, right? And Luther argues that that spoken word was, in fact, Christ himself, that God creates through Christ. Michelangelo's God is fierce-looking. He's very stern and unforgiving. He is a God who demands righteousness. Luther, I think, would have been very bothered by this. Luther would have liked to have seen a much more kind God, a God who is much more forgiving, a God who is more fatherly-like than stern, than this God right here. Luther would like to have seen much more of the bounty and richness of the earth given to man by God during creation. His God, and we know this from the illustrations that were appended to his own translation of the Old Testament, was a much more fatherly figure. There was much more emphasis in Luther's commentary on the richness and the bounty that God provided for man and woman before creating them. And I think it would have bothered Luther a lot that this was missing from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There is an emphasis upon Noah as a priest sacrificing, and the allegory is that of a priest in the church performing the Mass. No, Luther would not have liked this at all. Luther, in his commentary on the sacrifice of Noah, emphasizes not so much the sacrifice, but the rainbow that God puts in the sky after the sacrifice because he's pleased with the sacrifice. That rainbow is a promise of God showing mercy to mankind, and this is what Luther emphasizes in his commentary. In general, I think, Luther would like to have seen God portrayed as more caring, kind, and merciful. All right, any questions about Luther and the Sistine Chapel ceiling? Don, you have a question?
Well, it just kind of strikes me that Luther's opinion on this. How about today's? What would a person that believes in all the findings of modern science think of this? I can't imagine they could believe in literal interpretation of so much of this.
No, I think you're absolutely right. What we're talking about here is a 16th century understanding of creation. And it's interesting that already they're talking about, but it really happened this way, right, in the universities. I don't think that any reputable scientist would go in there and say that, yes, this is how it actually happened. Although, creation is not necessarily antithetical to science. There are a number of scientists who argue that, God could create the basic elements and could create the basic structure of those elements and put into place those kinds of laws and those kinds of circumstances that would allow things to emerge out of all of that matter. And the amazing thing about the world is that the world and the universe works according to fixed, immutable laws. This is incredible, right? This is what science is based upon, that you can reduplicate things because if you do this and this and this, this is going to happen. And so the question is then, who established this and this and this? Right? So you can, if you're a scientist, and I think we have a number of them here at Zion, you can hold a firm belief in God and God as being a creator God. The question would be, what is it exactly that he creates? How far into creation does he go? Well, would a modern scientist walk in there and look up and say, yep, that's pretty much how it happened? I don't think so. Yeah, Eric.
Two questions. One, what was the, I'm sure you covered it before, but from Michelangelo completing this until Luther comes along?
They are alive at the same time. That's why I did this. Because I thought, my whole premise was, okay, so, Luther shows up in Rome in the year 1510. He's sent by his order to Rome in 1510. And Michelangelo would have been painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling from 1508. So Luther's in Rome while Michelangelo's working on this. And my whole question was, okay, so, he finishes this up in the year 1512. What would Luther, walking into this ceiling, walking into the Sistine Chapel in the year 1520, looking up, what would he think about this
But
stuff?
didn't Luther document that since he was alive at the same time?
No, he
Or
didn't.
it's all interpretation of,
Yeah.
other people after he never commented. And then my next question was, did Michelangelo ever comment on his own stuff?
Yeah, okay, good questions. Okay, when I've been working my way through this with you and trying to give you some sense of what Luther would think about this, what I was doing was I was working through Luther's commentary on Genesis, right? Luther wrote a long commentary in the book of Genesis, and he covered all of these scenes in the book of Genesis in great detail. And so by reading his commentary in the book of Genesis, I think I got a pretty good idea of how he would react to what he saw up there. Did he know about Michelangelo? Did he say anything about the Sistine Chapel? No, their paths never crossed in Rome. They were completely different circles.
Okay.
Yeah. And what does Michelangelo have to say about this? This is really interesting. He writes a poem. The only thing, there are two different, a couple of letters in which he talks about how hard it was for him to paint. That he's constantly looking up, and he says, I have a huge goiter growing underneath my chin here, and my back's killing me, and things like this. He complains to a couple of friends about how hard it was to paint. And then the other thing is he wrote a long poem about his painting and how difficult it was and all this. But aside from that, he doesn't have any sort of notes or any sort of commentary on the Sistine Chapel ceiling wall. Okay, any other questions? All right, that's it. I hope the next time you go to the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you'll have a little bit better appreciation for what's going on up there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, if you have, if you fill out those evaluations, if you're on your way out, thanks.
That was when Vicky and Jess, the girls were there a couple of years ago. And they said it was hard to see them. But they said it was loud.
He gets fired or gets raised. All our land.
But it's just a masterpiece of the world. Yes, you too. You have family.
What?
7.18.
Yeah.
Out of 10. B minus, C plus.
Well, that's kind of,
Can't expect more.
Well, maybe not. I don't know.
Where are you going?
How are you?
Oh,
About 7.8.
About the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
next year, I will have surpassed all of my relatives. So I'm the eldest elder. Younger, okay, so you're the elder.
well, we had another cousin who was older. Oh, that's great. Yeah, the fire didn't get around San Francisco.
Yeah, all of my daddy's side and all died before.
Yeah, they said there was the worst pollution in the world. I'm doing fine.
Did you guys fill out forms down here?
Find out if she's raised or gets fired.
I don't know about that.
There's a long tradition
Yeah, 5 cents. Yeah, you're right. We don't have it all.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I can't find any drifters.
Well, that's what
Your family?
I've been looking for my old one.
Good job. Kathy Brad.
There is one online.
Yeah, I can tell you something. Our
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah. So, good topics, always good topics. Good.
So you're gonna find out whether you get a raise or you get fired, right? With all the evaluation?
I know, yeah. Marty, do you recognize this? Is this from your speaker the other day? You was up there on the video.
I don't know.
I didn't want to put it in my laptop, because that's how you get a virus. So you take it home and put it in yours.
I'll take it home.
Yeah,
I don't know that, yeah.
How are you doing?
I don't know, I haven't heard any.
Well,
Oh, you got her.
I'm not gonna put it in mine.
no, that was just a suggestion.
Are you,
Oh, no.
did you ask? Are you going to help with the 27?
I read it quickly.
Well, it's, okay, so the document itself is pretty radical.
It's radical.
It's exactly what you think the folks at the headquarters of the DLC would come up with. Yeah, it's what it's supposed to be. But the treatment, the presentation of the theme doesn't have to be that radical. I mean, the whole idea, obviously, there's issues of sexism and, gender perceptions out there and stuff like that we need to be aware of. And my thought was that you could, if you wanted, you could take some of the ideas from the ALCA statement on women and justice, but you don't have to follow it, slavishly. You could just use that to sort of build upon. Or you could, if you want, you could talk about that document, but there's a lot of stuff there. Gonna keep talking about patriarchy and the oppression of women and, how women...
In the Lutheran church?
Yes.
I'll read it first.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you want to do that or not, but, the whole idea that we should be more aware of some of the subconscious, perceptions we have. A good example of this was, this wasn't subconscious, when Nancy Pelosi was in talking to Donald Trump the other day, and Schumann was in there. He interrupted her 18 times, and he didn't interrupt Schumann one time. Think about that.
And when he was talking, looking at Schumann.
Not Nancy. Yeah. So, I mean, right there, you have, something like that.
He's one of those people who can't look a woman in the eyes.
Yes.
So
These are
for-
unfinished, these are finished.
Okay, good, yeah. So anyway, if you want to do it, I mean,
So who's agreed to do this with me?
Sharon Van Riper and Bernadette Quist. And nobody's been asked to be in charge. I mean, I think,
I thought you were in charge.
do you want me to?
Oh, you mean, yeah, don't you?
Of that day?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll start the discussion and throw out a question or two.
Yeah, I don't think they need a patriarchal figure.
No,
to
I
be
don't.
in charge.
Or a matriarch.
They need a patriarchal figure, that's what they need.
Yeah.